And good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Christian Nationalism and Internationalism, Evangelicals and U.S. Foreign Policy in Modern History. I'm very pleased to be joined by Lauren Turek. She is an Associate Professor of History and Director of Museum Studies at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Today is October the 4th, 2022. Hey, everybody. It's so wonderful to have all of you here. On behalf of my staff, Meredith, Mike, and Raven, I want to thank you for joining us for the ninth webinar of our current season. We had a busy day, we had a full day, we had a hard day at the National Humanities Center, but I guarantee you it wasn't as meaningful and exhausting as what each of you did today in the classes you were in. So we're very pleased that you're able to end your day and to come and join us and spend some time. As I look around the room, that includes some new faces and some old ones that I haven't seen in a little while. Hey, Tyler, it's good to have you. Tyler's joining us from Austin, Texas. Marta is joining us from Texas as well. Marta's at Collin College. As I look around the room, maybe from east to west, Cheryl, always great to have you here. Cheryl's in Modesto. Let's see who else is here. We've got Kristen from Cincinnati, Ohio. Great to have you join us tonight, Kristen. Lynn is in New Jersey. Sarah is here representing the Virtual Arkansas School. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight, Sarah. Jeanette's at the Pembroke Hill School in Kansas City. And it's always great to see past Teacher Advisory Council members. I'm talking to you, Brian, in North Andover, and you, Karen, up in Bering Strait School District in Alaska. It's wonderful to have you back. As always, we have a numerous representation from Los Angeles Unified, Alex at Woodrow Wilson High School, Whitney, Jacqueline, Allison, and hey, Natalie, I'm glad you're able to navigate our goofy registration system and join us here at the last minute. Thank you, all of you, for being here. The National Humanities Center is in Durham, and if you ever visit the area, you're more than welcome to stop by and say hi and see the center in person. And when you do, you'll go through that front lobby door right there in the middle of the screen. And not too far past the lobby, there's a relatively large kind of bookcase table where we have all of the major newspapers on a daily basis. So, you know, we live in this digital world now where everything is online and on our phones and on our iPads and laptops, but there still is something about having that tangible paper, the black smudges on your fingers when you're done. You can tell who's been reading them. But I think they're there, even if most people look at their news digitally, to remind our fellows and our scholars that there is a contemporary context that all of their work is being done in. And whether it's classical work, whether it's work at antiquity, whether it's work in multiple disciplines, the fact is they're all there to try to make sense of the world we're living in right now. And we're certainly hopeful that our conversation tonight with Professor Turek will help do just that. All the materials that we create, all the content we create at the center is intended to be free and open. That means it's got a Creative Commons license in which you can use it in your classroom and do so without fear of stepping on any boundaries. All of you have what we call a library card, and with that library card, you can access the readings and the primary sources that Professor Turek has provided. This is also the place where we will add the recording of tonight's session, as well as the PowerPoint that's associated with it. So it may be that you've had some time to go through the readings or spent some time looking at the primary sources, and if so, tonight's talk will probably be a little bit more robust. On the other hand, you're busy folks, and if you haven't had a chance, I do encourage you to go back and maybe review what you've learned, what we've discussed, maybe look at the recording, maybe identify some spaces whereby your students might join us, might join that in some kind of flipped model, and you can also find the associated slides that go with it. We do this for all of our webinars, and I do encourage you to go back and continue to look for updates on our webinar series, season series. As I was looking through some of the upcoming sessions, I thought these four might be of particular interest to the audience that we've convened tonight. That starts with, just in a few weeks, a double header. We're going to have two speakers on November the 3rd to discuss why teaching Maus matters more than ever. Scott Denham is a professor of German studies at Davidson College in North Carolina. You might recognize his name because he was gained some notoriety, some positive notoriety for providing free online tutorials for the state of Tennessee when Maus was banned last year. He'll be here to share his experiences, and he'll be joined by Barbara Mann, who's at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Later in the fall, we're joined by Andy Horowitz, who will be talking with us about Katrina, COVID, and climate crisis. Of course, here in the Southeast, violent storms over the last week have really been pretty damaging, and I certainly hope that everyone who can hear our voices is in a safe and dry place. But he'll be talking with us about the ways that humanities can help us understand climate crisis. After the new year, Mark Anthony Neal from nearby Duke University will be focused on the year 1968 and the role of soul music in the year of Black Power. And then later in the year, Timothy Beal, who's a professor of religion at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio, will be joining us to talk more about religion in America and how we can explore that landscape with students. I suspect that many of you attend our webinars because you appreciate the topic, or maybe you like to learn more about different parts of the humanities so that you can be better prepared in your classes. But I also suspect that many of you need and seek the CEU credit. If that's the case, of course, our webinars earn 5 credit hours for each attended webinar, but our online courses earn 35. And I would like to announce and share that we've made the Women of the Americas Early Encounters in Entangled History course free this coming fall. So if you use the code that you see on the screen, WAMS100, you can sign up for this course. It requires about 3 to 5 hours of blended and largely asynchronous work each week. And at the conclusion, you earn 35 CEU credit hours that have been recognized by most states, and including that big school district in Southern California. Take a look. We do cap this at 40 participants, and I think we're getting close. So if you're interested, please do sign up using the code WAMS100. I'd also like to announce that we are currently accepting applications for our next Teaching African American Studies Winter Institute, titled More Than a Slogan, Understanding the Historical Context of Black Lives Matter. We'll be bringing 20 teachers from across the country to the center for a full week. So for a whole week, you'll be in that building that I've showed you. We will pay all of your travel expenses, also offer you a $1,000 stipend, and we'll be working with scholars and past fellows to better understand the long historical context of the phrase and the meaning of Black Lives Matter. We are currently accepting applications. We will take them until October 28th, and we'll make announcements of this cohort in early November. Again, thank you so much to our Teacher Advisory Council, including those in the room with us tonight, for their ongoing contributions. It's their conversation and their feedback that really allows us, I hope, to create programs that are meaningful and relevant for what each of you do in your classroom. So while this is a conversation largely driven by Professor Turek and her PowerPoint, with me chiming in as the moderator, it also relies quite a bit on you as the audience. We do invite and encourage your participation in both the audience chat as well as the Ask Professor Turek tab. One of them is more informal. You can chatter, you can talk to each other, you can share links, you can respond to things that we say. The other is a little bit more formal. If you've got a question you would like me to bring forward as the moderator, please add that to the Ask the Professor tab, and when we take a break, take a pause, I'll bring those forward. I'll cite you by name, and we'll spend some time discussing those things that are of interest to you. So once again, welcome to tonight's webinar. It's titled Christian Nationalism and Internationalism, Evangelicals and U.S. Foreign Policy in Modern History. I'm joined tonight by Lauren Turek, Associate Professor of History and Director of Museum Studies at Trinity University. I'm also really pleased to welcome Sherilyn Stauffer back. Sherilyn is a high school teacher at Afton, Wyoming, a member of this year's TAC, and Sherilyn is going to be chiming in the audience chat, keeping things moving, and we'll also be developing some instructional resources based on tonight's webinar. So as an introduction, I'm done. Hey, Lauren, can you hear me down in Texas?
I can. Thank you so much.
It's so wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you for spending the evening with us as well. And you know, before we get started and I give you the keys to the car, I wouldn't mind starting with just a personal question, if I may. And
sure.
I'll ask, be a little extemporaneous. I'm going to go backwards here to put that question back up. And you know, I've asked the audience to consider ways that they approach or discuss the influence of religion on both past and current events, and if not, why they might not. And it occurred to me as I framed that question that it may be the singular most important element of our modern culture that people are the most afraid to talk about. Tell us how you address this in your own teaching and in your own writing.
This is such a wonderful question. And in terms of my research, I often tell people that I like to research and write about all the things that you're not supposed to talk about in company at dinner: religion, politics, and foreign policy. But we have to talk about it. And in my teaching, and I teach classes that are specifically on religion and politics, in fact, I take the approach that I've seen many of you noting, which is a very inclusive approach. I like to make sure that my students feel comfortable to discuss what can be contentious topics by being respectful to others, acknowledging that we live in a pluralistic country, a country that has always been pluralistic religiously, and that all of those beliefs or non-beliefs are valid and matter. And that we've had members from all different religious groups continue to contribute to shaping our national story. And so that's my approach. I also like to encourage my students to understand the past from a perspective of historical empathy, to really try to understand the thought processes that individuals who lived long ago or not that long ago brought to bear on the major questions of their time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if I can, I'm going to push into that a little bit further, I think, and suggest that part of it is what you are willing, you meaning you receiving this question, but also everyone in the audience, right? It's what we as educators are willing to model and willing to encourage in the conversations we have. But it also means that the students we're working with have to bring something to it. So my second question then is this: you're working with kids who very easily could have been in the classrooms of our audience, including and particularly Tyler in Austin and Carl in Karen's Independent School District in Texas. How have you seen your students when they arrive? How willing are they to engage in this conversation, or are they a little gun shy as well?
They are gun shy. I mean, this is really potentially contentious material. They take a little while to get comfortable with their classmates, to see how open-minded their classmates are going to be when we have discussions. And one of the things I try very hard to do in the classroom is to remind everyone that their views are valid, but that they need to engage in discourse in a polite and civic manner, that we're not attacking other people for their beliefs, that we need to listen to each other respectfully. But yeah, some of them are reticent at first.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And while my question was sincere and it connects very much to what you'll talk about tonight, I think it also goes a long way to articulating how we'd like the audience chat to go tonight as well, right? We're going to model that in our own discourse and the questions we ask and the ways that we interact in the chat box. So, Professor, thank you for doing that. I'm going to now give you the slideshow, and as the moderator, I'll bring you questions on occasion, and we're looking forward to walking through this story with you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk with you all tonight. And I want to thank Andy and the entire team at the NHC for their kind assistance in inviting me tonight and getting everything set up. Some of you may know or may have noticed that the term Christian nationalism has been in the news quite a bit as late, from Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene loudly embracing the Christian nationalist label to Lauren Boebert proclaiming her belief that the church is supposed to direct the government. Some of your students may have asked about Christian nationalism. They might have used the term in class, in discussion, or in essays. Now, given how common the term has become in our current political and academic discourse, you might assume that it's of recent coinage. But for fun, I plugged the term into Google's Ngram viewer just to see how frequently the phrase has appeared in digital text or digitized text going back to the 19th century. Now, there are some limitations to what this tool can tell us, of course, but in this case, it does show that this term has existed for a long time and that its usage has peaked at certain moments in history, especially during the Cold War in the late 1970s and 1980s, and then again, very recently. Christian internationalism is perhaps not so common a term, yet Christian nationalist leaders have not limited their rhetoric to the domestic sphere. Back in 2019, then Secretary of State and avowed Christian nationalist Mike Pompeo launched a State Department commission that aimed to place a set of Christian nationalist values at the forefront of U.S. foreign policy. What I want to do tonight is dig in to these concepts of Christian nationalism and Christian internationalism particularly as they relate to U.S. foreign policy history. Now, before we delve in, I want to give you a brief note about my own background. I am a historian of U.S. foreign relations, and a lot of the research that I've done has focused on politically conservative Christians and their efforts to influence U.S. foreign policy. I am not a Christian, so I'm writing as an outsider to this faith tradition. But I approach my research with both historical empathy and a critical eye as I try to understand how beliefs, worldviews, and ideologies have motivated domestic actors to care about foreign affairs and to advocate for specific policies. In my talk tonight, I've shared with you two pieces of my own writing, a chapter from my book and an article that I've written on Christian nationalism and internationalism, along with a primary source from President Reagan. The talk does not specifically mirror the two pieces of my writing, although it really builds from them, so they'll be useful. But what I wanted to do was spend a lot of time with primary sources for you. I know in my own teaching, I find one of the best ways to cultivate historical empathy among my students is to let them engage with the thoughts and ideas from a diverse range of people from the past. And I think that can be a really helpful way for you in your classrooms to think about some of these issues. Okay. So let's dive in. Let's start by defining some key terms. So in the article I shared with you about Christian nationalism in the Contra War, I identified Christian nationalism as an ideology that merges Christian and national identities. Christian nationalism is not just a U.S. phenomenon. That's something the article makes clear. But in the U.S. context, it tends to take the form of a belief that the United States is a Christian nation, and that therefore its culture, laws, and politics should reflect Christian beliefs. In practice, especially in our present times, this takes the form of conservative activists advocating for what they call, quote, traditional values and social hierarchies. This often includes opposition to gay marriage, a belief that men should have authority over women and children, and the idea that only certain types of people, often white, native-born, or Christian, are true Americans who should enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. Christian internationalism is quite different. It is useful to start here by comparing just the words nationalism and internationalism. We often think of nationalism as being a strong or even chauvinistic devotion to one's nation or its interests. Internationalism, on the other hand, is all about cooperation and collaboration among nations. It connotes an interest in the wider world and a desire for global connection. Nationalism and internationalism are not inherently opposed, but they are distinct concepts. Christian internationalism reflects the belief amongst many Christians that they are part of a global community of believers. This belief is rooted in the biblical idea that all who are baptized become one in the body of Christ. Christian internationalists believe they need to collaborate within that body of believers to fulfill their biblical duty to achieve the Great Commission, the edict to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. We see Christian nationalism and internationalism blended at times, such as when conservative U.S. Christians work with Christians in other countries to promote certain political values, policies, or laws, or cultural norms that reflect their interpretation of their faith, as well as their interpretation of U.S. values. I want to also define evangelical or evangelicalism as our readings for today focused on this group. Evangelicalism is a diverse movement, comprised of many different denominations and people of all races and social classes. Evangelicals are Protestants who share a core belief in the authority of the Bible, in the need to have an individual salvation experience, and in their mission to spread the word of God through evangelism. Although we think of U.S. Christian nationalism as a predominantly white and sometimes white supremacist phenomenon, evangelicalism as a religious movement is diverse. There are sizable populations of Black, Latinx, Asian, and indigenous evangelicals in the United States, and a significant proportion of the global evangelical population lives in the global South and is not white. Not all evangelicals are politically conservative, and not all are Christian nationalists. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, though, conservative and predominantly white evangelicals who embraced Christian nationalism and internationalism began to coalesce as a political movement, and eventually as a foreign policy lobby. Their involvement had profound implications for the role that the U.S. played in the world during the late Cold War and beyond. To understand how this came to be, we need to grapple with how the United States itself became a world power, and with the blend of Christian and nationalist ideologies that were at play in that development. To do this, we need to go back to the 19th century, when the United States emerged as a formidable industrial power. Economic power did not translate immediately into global political or military might, however. In the 1880s, when Britain, Germany, and the major powers of Europe began seizing massive overseas colonies for subjugation and resource extraction, the United States lacked both the will and the capacity to join them. Some Americans rejected imperialism on principle, seeing it as at odds with U.S. Republican ideals. Others rejected imperialism due to racism. They viewed non-whites as inferior and did not want to add non-white territories to the country. This is not to say that no Americans expressed interest in overseas expansionism. In 1860, Senator William H. Seward, who would later serve as Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, gave a speech in Minnesota titled "Destiny of the United States." I have excerpted here and highlighted some key points, and if you look at those highlighted pieces, you will see that he is laying out a vision for a future United States hemispheric empire, one that would include all of Alaska, then under the control of Russia, Canada, and all of Central and South America. His use of the word destiny, his references to the Almighty, all of this suggests that his vision for a United States that would encompass all of the Americas was God ordained. The thing is, in the 1860s, most Americans did not embrace Seward's vision. They were focused on more pressing matters. The Civil War was on, and then Reconstruction and transcontinental expansion were occupying people's attention. There was no popular clamor for the acquisition of Alaska, which Seward negotiated in 1867 to very little acclaim, as this cartoon from the time illustrates. We often hear about Seward gaining Alaska as Seward's folly. It was roundly ridiculed, and you see him here lampooned as a child who has purchased a kind of useless piece of land from the Russians. But things changed pretty quickly. 10 years later, Seward's son, Frederick Seward, who was then Assistant Secretary of State, negotiated an important treaty with the leader of Samoa that granted the United States a coaling station in Pongo Pongo. Coaling stations were essential for imperial expansion. Imperial expansion required a strong navy to project power and to protect trade. And a navy needs places to refuel. As you can see from the map, by 1899, the United States had acquired a number of small territories and coaling stations. Its victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War was a stepping stone to imperial expansion and a first step toward global power. There were many factors that led the United States to intervene in the struggle for Cuban independence from Spain. But given our topic tonight, I want to briefly talk about the role that Christian nationalism and internationalism played. The Spanish treatment of the Cuban people during the conflict was abhorrent, a combination of forced relocations, scorched earth policies, and mass death that wiped out some 20% of the population. U.S. citizens were horrified to read about the brutality. Newspapers called for war against Spain as an act of humanitarianism. Many cast interventions as a means to advance what they called Christian civilization, an opportunity to rescue the Cuban people from the immoral, despotic Catholic Spaniards, and to bring them under U.S. Christian tutelage. These articles suggested that the United States could act as an instrument of God's will by bringing Christianity, democratic governance, and civilizational uplift to a benighted people. It is really important to note here that these folks saw Christianity as an integral part of civilization and of U.S. political norms. This was a notion that Protestant leaders had been touting for some time. Josiah Strong, who was a leader in the progressive era social gospel movement, argued in his 1885 book, Our Country, that the United States, as the apex of Anglo-Saxonism, would lead the world by imposing Christianity and its, quote, superior civilization on all others. You can see that where I've excerpted a little bit from this book, and you can get a sense of how he was thinking about Christianity as being related to civilization, seeing them as integral to each other, and also that the U.S. was going to lead in spreading its values around the world. Christianity, U.S. nationalism, and white supremacy in this case were all so closely correlated within this ideology as to be inseparable. President William McKinley actually drew on a lot of these ideas when he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Spain. In his speech to Congress, he implied that U.S. international engagement would enable the United States to do God's will, and he claimed that by bringing hostilities in Cuba to an end, quote, our aspirations as a Christian, peace-loving people will be realized, end quote. After the war, when debates raged about whether or not the United States should take control of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, McKinley justified his decision to seize these countries in part by claiming that imperial control would allow the United States to tutor the people of these nations in democratic government and Christianity, therefore civilizing them. The idea that non-white, non-Protestant peoples were uncivilized, of course, reflected the racist ideology of Anglo-Saxonism that Protestant leaders like Josiah Strong had preached. And you can see in this later sort of article about McKinley, he describes his thought process in taking those territories as being one that came to him from God, and it reflects his belief that those people were not capable of self-government and he needed to uplift and Christianize them. Something that comes again in this cartoon here, this idea, Our Christmas Tree, another primary source from Puck magazine in 1899, that shows these other peoples as children being gifted civilization and Christianity and education and democracy from Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty. After the Philippine-American War, the United States pulled back a bit from the world stage and from taking on formal colonies, though it did continue to try to take informal empire or create informal empire through gunboat and dollar diplomacy. So it didn't abandon internationalism. That said, it really wasn't until World War II that the United States fully embraced its capacity to act as a world power and committed itself to engaged internationalism in the decades that followed. The idea that spreading democracy and Christianity went hand in hand persisted and evolved over the course of the 20th century. As the United States itself gained power, becoming a global superpower at the end of World War II, and committed itself to ongoing internationalism and the exercise of that power on the world stage, U.S. Christian nationalists and internationalists saw tremendous opportunities to pursue their goals of spreading their faith, as well as U.S. political and cultural influence worldwide. I want to pause here to see if we have any questions.
Thanks so much, Professor. We do have some questions that have queued up, and I'm going to remind our audience that you too can submit a question using the Ask the Professor tab. This first question comes from James. James is in Los Angeles, and he wonders if there's a specific date or time period where U.S. Christian nationalism or imperialism specifically started. Is there a specific person that our audience can identify as someone who started the movement in the American government?
So this is an idea that evolved kind of gradually over time. One of the things that I saw in the chat earlier were folks talking about, for example, during the Revolution, folks who were arguing that American independence was God-ordained. So we're seeing some of those ideas even very early on in the nation. We should remember that many of those ideas that some of the folks who came over from Europe as colonists very early on, they brought with them ideas about religious freedom. That said, they were also not necessarily extending that religious freedom to other Christians in their own midst. So we might be a little, we might be critical about that. But these ideas had a long history in the United States. So they germinate over time. At every point, you can also see individuals pushing back against these ideas, even in the Revolution. But we're seeing those ideas as being in play really throughout early American history. When we talk about U.S. imperialism, that has more of a kind of definite starting point that historians look at. We often look at the Spanish-American War as the moment when the U.S. is really starting to take some territories. So that's one of the reasons I highlighted it. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. This next question comes from Joe. Joe is just outside of Chicago, and he wonders how this message, if we can sort of put a box around it as a singular message, how was it transmitted? Was it through churches, through sermons, through newspapers? How did this sort of become a pervasive idea?
It's a wonderful question as well. Yeah, one of this comes in a lot of ways. So we're seeing it certainly in sermons. We're seeing it in the way that folks are reading their Bible. They're looking very much to the Great Commission, where God, and Jesus tells folks that they need to go out, their disciples, that they need to go out and spread the word. And this seems to many people to be the sort of core function that they need to serve, right? So missionary work in the 19th century in the United States really explodes. So there's this enormous sort of push among Protestants in the United States to engage in missionary work, especially by the late 19th century. This is coming to in Christian newspapers and magazines. We're seeing this in rhetoric from certain politicians. We see some of this rhetoric at home in terms of efforts to evangelize indigenous groups in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of all over. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Next question comes from Donnie. Donnie's in Evansville, Indiana, and it's a similar question, maybe an extension. And he's wondering if there was any kind of evangelical voting bloc in the 19th century.
So not the way that there is now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where that voting bloc came from a little later. Mm-hmm. In the 19th century, evangelicalism is a bit different. It's not necessarily aligned with one party or another. There are evangelicals, for example, on both sides of the Civil War. There are, really Protestants in general on all sides. We see really progressive Protestants progressive movement Protestants who are voting very strongly for social gospel principles. So Josiah Strong is an example of that kind of progressive era impulse coming from Protestants. But it's not, Christianity was a little more suffused throughout the population, so they weren't necessarily representing one voting bloc.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Just a few more questions. This one comes from Ida. Ida's in Los Angeles and wonders if she's asking specifically about primary sources, but perhaps she's also asking just about pushback. Was there evidence of pushback against the role of the church in imperialism in the 19th century?
Oh, yes, a huge amount, absolutely. Yeah, there was an entire anti-imperialist league made up of people like Jane Addams, who's, of course, a major figure in the settlement house movement. Andrew Carnegie is a key person who pushes back against imperialism. And they had a number of writings where they're saying that this is not the right thing to do. So I think searching for the Anti-Imperialist League is a good one to look at. There's lots of political cartoons that get at this. So there's a lot of good primary resources out there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One more question, Professor, and then we'll move on. This one comes from Jacob, also in Southern California. Jacob wonders if there is any research that suggests that the Christianity's mission to indoctrinate the entire world would lead to a new world order in terms of religion. Was there any possibility that the entire world would become a singular religion?
That was the hope from many evangelicals, that they would be successful in evangelizing the entire world, at least giving everyone the opportunity to hear the word of God, and then creating a kind of kingdom on earth, essentially. Yeah, that was the hope.
Great. Well, Lauren, why don't we move on, and we'll take a break soon and answer some more questions.
Great. Okay. So we left off talking about how it was really during, with World War II that the United States becomes a world power, a superpower. Another key development in U.S. Christianity also occurred during World War II, and that was the establishment of the National Association of Evangelicals in 1942. This organization was to be the guidestone of a new evangelicalism, an effort to forge a middle way between fundamentalist and modernist expressions of Christianity that had been at odds since the end of the Progressive Era. If you think back to the fierce debates between fundamentalists and modernists that erupted around the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, that's a good example of what this debate looked like. The National Association of Evangelicals hoped to give voice to U.S. evangelicals who felt alienated by the liberal Federal Council of Churches, as well as by the most radically conservative fringes of the fundamentalist movement. This group aimed to forge new relationships with government, to take advantage of radio and other communications technology, and to support evangelistic missions throughout the world. Within 2 years, the organization had grown to about 400,000 members, and membership continued to balloon from there. Despite their best efforts, though, evangelical Christians in the United States remained divided along denominational lines in the 1940s and 1950s, a reality that undermined their ability to influence public life and to spread their faith to non-believers. In 1956, Carl F. H. Henry and evangelist Billy Graham, along with some other leading evangelicals, came together to found a new magazine called Christianity Today in an effort to unite evangelicals from different denominations. Christianity Today complemented the ultimately successful efforts of the National Association of Evangelicals to bring cohesion and greater public influence to U.S. evangelicals. Furthermore, from the outset, the magazine included an international focus, consummate with Billy Graham's belief that, quote, people all over the world are hungry to hear the word of God, and that evangelicals had a biblical mandate to fulfill that need. This internationalist focus often came in the form of reports about suffering and human rights abuses abroad, especially religious persecution in communist countries like the Soviet Union. Editor Carl F. H. Henry believed that evangelicalism and the ability to practice Christianity were intertwined with American values such as freedom of expression, religious liberty, and democratic governance. The perspectives that Henry, Billy Graham, and other evangelicals brought to bear on their fellow believers and American political culture at large shaped national thinking about foreign policy, especially among politically and theologically conservative Christians. Yet it still took several decades before these ideas found their expression in effective evangelical foreign policy activism. This is partly because, as I discussed in the chapter from the book that I shared with you, evangelicals did not act or see themselves as a coherent political coalition until the mid to late 1970s. During the 1960s and early 1970s, a number of domestic political issues began to mobilize Protestants, conservative Protestants, and Catholics. Supreme Court rulings such as Engel v. Vitale in 1962, Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, Green v. Connolly in 1970, and Roe v. Wade in 1973, alongside cultural changes that ranged from the feminist, the gay rights, and the civil rights movements to that whole rebellion, free love, drugs, hippie stuff. All of those changes created a sense amongst conservative Christians that their beliefs and their way of life was under assault. And because they firmly believed that their beliefs and way of life also represented true American values, they began to mobilize in an effort to reclaim what they saw as their rightful dominance in U.S. popular and political culture. Evangelicals such as James Dobson and Jerry Falwell founded new political organizations focused on the family and moral majority, respectively, that made explicit efforts to organize evangelicals at the grassroots. Both of these groups used a language of family values to attempt to attract members who shared their religious beliefs about hierarchical gender roles, sex, and the proper social order. This happened alongside a revival of evangelicalism. When Newsweek declared 1976 the year of the evangelicals, the movement was on the uptick. Some 1/3 of Americans claimed that they had had a born-again experience. Between 1976 and 1980, the evangelical presence in U.S. politics grew dramatically, thanks to Christians organizing, to media attention to the movement, and to increasingly powerful televangelist networks. Now, the 1970s were pretty rough globally. It was a rough decade, and many Americans had felt battered by a moribund economy with stagflation, high unemployment, skyrocketing interest rates, deindustrialization, and urban decay. And there were also some hits to national morale from scandals like Watergate, the disastrous withdrawal from Vietnam, a series of oil shocks, and the Iran hostage crisis. There was a sense that the country was headed in the wrong direction, that it had become weak in foreign affairs and unable to respond effectively to crises both at home and abroad. The religious right believed that the cultural changes of the 1960s and 1970s had also brought on moral decline for the country. And a lot of people were looking for a hero, someone who could rescue them from these doldrums. Many found that hero in the Republican nominee for president in the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan. And the religious right worked very hard to ensure that he got elected. They used direct mail, voter registration drives, and voter report cards to get people to the polls. The Christian right, including conservative evangelicals, began to function not just as a political bloc, but as a very effective one. Now, Reagan was not a particularly strong churchgoer, and although he was a Christian, his beliefs were somewhat unorthodox. But that doesn't matter because he was very skilled at rallying evangelicals in particular. He embraced the belief that Christianity was central to U.S. political values, that the country was a Christian nation, and he spoke the language of the religious right very effectively. Early on in the 1980 campaign, he told a gathering of evangelicals, quote, "You may not endorse me, but I endorse you," signaling that he supported their political aims. We also see this in the speech he gave to the National Association of Evangelicals in 1983, which we're going to talk a little bit more later. As I discussed at the end of the chapter I shared, evangelicals saw Reagan as a leader who would champion both their domestic and their foreign policy objectives. And one of their key foreign policy objectives was promoting religious liberty and the ability to evangelize freely all over the world. Let's go back a bit to talk a little bit about how these foreign policy goals developed. So beginning in the early 1970s, evangelicals in the United States were growing increasingly worried because there was this tremendous population boom in the global south, so in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And they were worried that they were falling behind in their mission to spread the Christian gospel to all the people on earth because of this population boom. So many people were being born in these regions where Christianity was not the dominant religion, that evangelicals feared they could never keep up. And all of this was unfolding in the context of the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an existential global struggle for hearts and minds. The Soviet Union, Soviet bloc, China, and other communist states were officially atheist, and many imposed restrictions on religious practice. Despite constitutions that affirmed religious liberty, many of these states, in fact, practiced absolutely brutal religious persecution against Christians, Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities. Christians and religious minorities also face persecution in some Middle Eastern countries. In short, evangelicals committed to global evangelism faced a slew of challenges: a growing population in the global south, state-sponsored atheism and persecution in communist countries, and restrictions on their ability to evangelize in what they called closed societies. In the mid-1970s, evangelicals sought to meet these challenges head-on, and they rededicated themselves to the task of spreading the gospel and greatly expanded their global missionary efforts. For this reason, in 1974, the famous American evangelist Billy Graham called on evangelicals throughout the world to come together and renew their commitment to global evangelism. At an international conference that brought together evangelicals from Western nations as well as the global South, Graham reflected on all of the events of the past 2 decades. He told the audience that he saw a world that was open to evangelism, but also dealing with all sorts of crises and spiritual malaise. Everything from the cultural revolutions that shook Western societies in the 60s to those oil shocks in the 70s and Watergate. Graham looked at those and he warned that, as he said, quote, "the world may be standing at the very brink of Armageddon." He thought humanity was teetering on the precipice and that only Christian salvation could prevent it from toppling into the abyss. For Graham and like-minded evangelicals who saw social ills through the lens of biblical prophecies, the challenges of the time made the evangelistic mission of the church seem really urgent. And evangelicals heeded his call. U.S. Christian groups flocked to Latin America, to Africa, to Asia, and Eastern Europe to evangelize and plant churches. As they did so, they forged relationships with their brethren abroad. They also witnessed firsthand the perpetration of religious persecution, state violence, and acts of genocide against inhabitants in their new mission fields. While overseas, as you can see, missionaries wrote letters to their congregations at home describing what they saw and who they met. When they got back to the United States, they shared details about their experiences. These experiences and interactions, along with their deep-seated anti-communism, shaped the opinions that American evangelicals held about what was happening in the wider world. Overseas missionary work, coupled with new technology and communications, plus a sense that they belonged to a transnational community of believers, exposed evangelicals to foreign policy issues abroad, gave them a means to share information across borders, and kept them focused on the needs and challenges that their brethren faced in other countries. As conservative evangelicals gained political power in the 1970s with the rise of the religious right, they were better able to use that influence to shape foreign policy. The concern that many evangelicals felt about religious repression in totalitarian regimes and the threat it posed to the global missionary agenda was not new. Christians and Catholics in the United States had been testifying in Congress for decades about it. But the power that evangelicals had to mobilize as a bloc and influence Congress and the policymaking process, that was new. Evangelicals focused on what they saw as their duty to spread the gospel. They privileged religious freedom as part of that and the freedom to evangelize. And they started to see those as the most fundamental of human rights. So concerns about religious persecution and other abuses against Christians led these groups to advocate for a Christian U.S. foreign policy, one that would promote U.S. religious values and protect American missionaries as well as those they were evangelizing. We might think of this as an operationalization of Christian nationalism for Christian internationalist aims. For this reason, as you saw in the chapter I shared, evangelicals pushed members of Congress as well as the State Department and the President to advocate for the release of religious prisoners in the Soviet Union and for economic sanctions on countries that made it difficult for their citizens to practice their faith freely or to evangelize. These views also led many evangelicals to perceive authoritarian and other expressly anti-totalitarian or anti-communist regimes as friendly to their objectives. This perception enabled evangelicals to interpret repression and state violence in authoritarian countries as an acceptable or even desirable effort to combat the spread of communism. Their efforts to press Congress to take up the cause of Christian freedom and to sanction countries that persecuted Christians bore some fruit in the, as you saw in the chapter I shared. Though U.S. leaders such as Ford and Carter generally relied on quiet diplomacy rather than overt public protests or sanctions to compel the Soviet Union to release religious prisoners or to allow freer religious practice. However, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, even back-channel efforts to improve conditions in the USSR for religious dissidents dropped off as the President, State Department, and National Security Council grappled with policy issues and security threats they saw as more critical. In response to this, evangelicals ramped up their efforts to foster change through congressional action and grassroots organizing. As I noted, by the 1980 election, they had come to see Ronald Reagan as a key proponent of their vision for implementing a Christian U.S. foreign policy. And I want to pause here again to see if there are any questions before we move on to some case studies where we can see how this played out in practice in Central America, which was a key battleground for Reagan as he revivified the Cold War against the Soviet Union and sought to roll back communism.
Yes, we have lots of questions that have built up, and I appreciate you walking us through that and inspiring these questions. They're going to bounce around a little bit on the chronology, and so I'll try to stitch them together and make sense for you. Here's my first question I'm going to bring forward, and it's partly a point that I think you just made. Seth, who's in Knoxville, commented and then questioned that recently we had a webinar. Julian Zelizer from Princeton led it on the presidency of Jimmy Carter. And,
yes.
It was clear that President Carter was a deeply religious man of faith. He was very open about that. He was, he was probably far more religious. I hate to make those kinds of estimations than President Reagan was, but he didn't have a real passion for foreign policy. Talk to us a little bit about why Reagan, not Carter, became sort of the savior. That's the wrong word to use in this context. The hero in 1980, and not Carter.
I think one issue. So Carter, I think, cared very passionately about international human rights, but he focused primarily on the kind of human rights abuses that were happening in authoritarian countries, places where people were being tortured, disappeared, etc. And he was not so eager to publicly go after, say, the Soviet Union for its persecution of Christians. I say publicly because he was working behind the scenes to do things like secure the release of religious prisoners like Georgi Vance and the Siberian Seven. So I think the perception from U.S. evangelicals looking at him is that he's not advocating loudly and publicly enough for these folks. And then, of course, when the Iran hostage crisis happens, he seems really impotent and not quite up to the task. There's a lot of sort of disasters there. And so there's a perception that develops that he's just incapable of dealing with these issues, and that Reagan, who's really rattling the sabers, really speaking very loudly against communism, that he's going to be the guy to come in and fix everything.
Yeah. This question comes from Jen. Jen's in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and wonders, going back now a bit, several decades, about the either specific and explicit impact of the world wars, particularly World War II, on this generation of evangelicals. How did World War II play into this narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when we look at the language that FDR used to speak about the war, he cast the war in really stark terms as a battle for the forces of democracy and religion against the forces of evil in the world, against the forces of tyranny. He made it clear that Germany was repressing people based on religion, and that, and not just Jews, but that it was the sort of fascist movement is an attack on religion. The Office of War Information actually mounted a huge exhibit in New York City that had all these huge tableaus showing what might happen if fascism came to the United States, and the persecution of people based on their faith was highlighted as a way that fascism would attack core U.S. values. So I think these folks are influenced by that idea that, you know, the U.S. is fighting, in this case, an existential war against fascism or against communism to promote its values, and that the promotion of religious freedom is a core piece of that.
Great. And this question takes that a little bit further. This is from Bastami, who's in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech. Wonders what kind of religious discourse did U.S. foreign policymakers adopt, if they did, when the U.S. engaged in armed conflicts with Christian majority countries? The example Bastimi gave is World War II, but how did, just in general, how did U.S. foreign policymakers react to engaging with other Christian countries?
Well, so Germany is a good example where they still were using a language of religious liberty and sort of arguing in World War II that these folks are fascist. They're kind of going against the core principles of religious liberty. You know, in terms of other wars where they're engaging predominantly with Christians, you know, more of the conflicts that we see after World War II are with communist countries, or their covert operations to remove left-leaning governments. And so you'll see engagements with Catholic majority countries in Latin America, especially, and there it's very much making sure that they are not putting the wrong kind of Christians in power. So there's a concern in Latin America about left-leaning Catholics, liberation theology. They want to make sure that basically conservative Christians are in power, anti-communist.
Yeah, and it's a question that Cheryl from Los Angeles asks. She notes that the Catholic Church is very different in terms of how it sees the authority of the Church and other issues, and asked for some expansion on the role of the Catholic Church. Can you make more comment on that, or do you feel like that summarizes it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I cover in the article that I shared, the one about the Contra War, is that there is actually quite a lot of disagreement within the Catholic Church in Latin America about the politics, the situation. As with evangelicals, there are conservative and liberal Catholics, and they sort of argued over what their focus should be. And so the Catholic Church around the world was often, promoting the idea of, either caring for the poor, especially in Latin America. The Catholic movement is really powerful in communist countries like Poland as an agency that's pushing against communism. So Catholicism is really significant too. And sometimes evangelicals see them as partners and sometimes not. It just depends on the issue.
Right. Last question before we move on. I'm going to give this to Sherilyn, who's joining us from Afton, Wyoming. She's tonight's TA. She notes that she doesn't think that Reagan used the city on the hill analogy from the New Testament in the speech you shared, but he did at least one other time, right? And perhaps George W. Bush did as well, or perhaps his father. Aren't these contextually about Christian internationalism?
Oh, hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. Reagan loved the city on the hill analogy. He used it in a lot of his speeches. And of course, this is the idea that the sort of new nation, the United States, well, at that point it was the colonies, but the idea that we were going to be a city upon a hill, a kind of beacon for the world, a beacon of freedom, a beacon of religious liberty, a beacon of democracy. And Reagan harkened back to that idea numerous times, and it very much speaks to both Christian internationalism, the idea that the United States is going to redeem the whole world through its example, that it's going to, provide an example of freedom, or that it would actually go out and foster democracy worldwide. But it's also a Christian nationalist idea, the idea that there is something that's sort of inherently Christian, inherently God ordained about that mission for the United States. So I love that question. It's a really good one.
Professor, we have about 30 minutes left, so why don't we move forward, and then we'll take some more questions soon.
Great. Okay, I'm going to dive in here. I want to do some close readings and some case studies for you. And then at the end, I'll touch briefly on Christian Zionism. All right, so earlier in this talk, I mentioned that one of the ways that Reagan appealed to evangelicals beyond his policy priorities was by speaking the language of evangelicals. He gave them a sense that he was speaking directly to them and to their interests. And evangelicals were a key part of the coalition of Americans who supported Reagan in the 1980 election, a coalition that included affluent business owners, middle-class suburbanites, Southern whites, and even blue-collar industrial workers and Northern white ethnics who had previously been reliable Democratic voters. That coalition won him the 1980 election with just about 51% of the popular vote. And he came into office promising a fresh start for the country, a kind of morning in America. And he set about to put in place conservative policies, including massive tax cuts for the wealthy, massive deficit spending to pay for a large peacetime military buildup, and muscular interventionism in Latin America, the Middle East, and elsewhere as he sought to roll back communism worldwide. Reagan continued to court evangelical support throughout his time in office, speaking their language and speaking directly to them on issues they cared about. One such speech came on March 8, 1983, when he addressed the annual National Association of Evangelicals convention. In his speech, which is included as part of the reading for this webinar, he noted that the National Association of Evangelicals was known for their spiritual and humanitarian work, and he thanked them for their intercessory prayers, which are prayers that a Christian makes on behalf of another person, in this case, their prayers for him. So he opens the speech by praising them for their work, all the work they do at home and abroad, and he cracks a joke, and then he gets right down to business. And if you later look at the document that I shared, in the very last paragraph on page 359, Reagan tells the gathered evangelicals that it was, quote, a commitment to freedom and personal liberty that brought God-fearing men and women to work in public life. He said those values, freedom and personal liberty, that they rested on the principle, quote, that freedom prospers only where the blessings of God are avidly sought and humbly accepted. Reagan continued, and now on the next page, by asserting that, quote, the American experiment in democracy rests on this insight, and what he then describes as a Christian founding, where it was God that granted core American freedoms, God who granted human rights. Now, from this perspective, he then assures his audience that the Reagan administration, quote, is motivated by a political philosophy that sees the greatness of America in you, her people, and in your families, churches, and other institutions that foster and nourish values like concern for others and respect for the rule of law under God. Essentially, Reagan is stating that he believes that the United States is a Christian nation and that Christian values should be at the helm of government. We see this in the discussion that follows, where he links this belief to his agenda for domestic policies and cultural changes that would reflect the aspirations of the religious right, including prayer in school and restricting abortion access. Now, at the end of the speech, which is what I have up on the PowerPoint here, he turns to foreign policy. And this is where we can see the marriage of these Christian nationalist principles to a Christian internationalist ethos and the anti-communist aims of the administration. In this part of the speech, Reagan speaks to one of the core anxieties of the Cold War, the nuclear arms race between the United States and its communist adversary, the Soviet Union. This was at a time when the nuclear freeze movement was quite strong, and Reagan opposed the freeze in part because he thought that the détente policies of Nixon, Ford, and Carter had allowed the Soviet Union to build up its nuclear arsenal. He didn't believe Soviet leaders had negotiated in good faith. And he reminded listeners that not only did he believe that the Soviet Union aimed to use its power to spread communism, but that people living in the Soviet Union were suffering under totalitarian tyranny, suffering in a country that he said placed the state rather than God at its apex. And although he wished for the salvation of the people living in that totalitarian darkness, he wanted to see the United States strengthen itself so it could fight for a world made in its image, a democratic, capitalist, godly world. And he said that he believed the United States could meet the challenge that global communism posed because, quote, "I believe that communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written. I believe this because the source of our strength in the quest for human freedom is not material, but spiritual." He closed by quoting from Isaiah and suggesting that evangelicals had a key role to play in changing the world along these lines. The core ideas here, that the United States had a spiritual mission to save the world from communism, but also that the rights that American citizens enjoyed came directly from God, are important. They are ideas that evangelicals had long been promoting in their congressional testimony about human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. Reagan was speaking back to evangelicals their own language about human rights, their own vision for U.S. human rights policies that would elevate religious liberty above all. In 1981, Robert Dugan, the director of the National Association of Evangelicals, had testified in support of Reagan's choice for Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, Ernest Lefevre. He saw him as being really closely aligned with evangelical views on human rights issues. Dugan said that evangelicals viewed rights as coming directly from God, and he described religious freedom as the primary human right, without which no other rights could meaningfully exist. He downplayed the emphasis that secular human rights organizations placed on economic justice or on the abuses that right-wing authoritarian leaders exacted. He argued instead that there should be a greater focus on those countries that restricted religious liberty, countries like the Soviet Union. For Dugan and for other evangelicals who shared this view, religious freedom was the primary human right. And because of the evangelical commitment to achieving the Great Commission, to sharing the gospel to all the world, they believed that religious liberty, by which they meant their freedom to evangelize and the freedom of people who were unreached to hear the gospel, that was the most vital thing. No earthly privation could compare to the loss of potential ultimate salvation. So during the Reagan years, evangelical Christians used the lobbying power that they had built in the 70s to involve themselves actively in fights to bring greater religious freedom to persecuted Christians, not just in the Soviet bloc, but all over the world. They wanted to roll back communism so that Christianity could flourish. And that latter goal neatly intersected with the Reagan administration's desire to eliminate communist, socialist, and left-leaning governance and to see them replaced with democratic capitalist allies, especially in Central America. To this end, evangelicals were especially active in Guatemala, where evangelicalism was growing rapidly. Back in 1976, a devastating earthquake had struck the country, and in response, American evangelical organizations mobilized to deliver aid and to plant churches. One of the groups that traveled down to provide aid and to spread the gospel established a church called El Verbo, the Church of the Word. Among the many Guatemalans who joined this church was a brigadier general in the Guatemalan army named Efrain Rios Montt. In March 1982, Montt was working as the academic director of El Verbo's Christian Day School when he heard an announcement on the radio. A group of young officers in the Guatemalan army, disillusioned by government corruption and election fraud, had staged a coup d'etat at the National Palace in Guatemala City. They were forming a military junta, and they had named Rios Montt to be one of its members, even though he wasn't on active duty. Rios Montt asked the elders of his church for guidance before accepting the call, And they told reporters that they had laid hands on him, that they prayed over him, and then sent him out with God's blessing. Through their prayers, Rios Montt came to believe that God ordained him to lead Guatemala. And within a few months, he had marginalized the other junta members and declared himself the president of the country. And because of the involvement of U.S. evangelical missionaries, as well as Guatemala's strategic significance, influential evangelists such as Pat Robertson took a lot of interest in Rios Montt, motivated as much as by their shared Christian beliefs as by the sense that he was a really strong anti-communist. American evangelical leaders and other groups began supporting Rios Montt's regime through public outreach, fundraising, and congressional lobbying. And despite mounting evidence that Rios Montt's campaign against Guatemala's communist insurgency involved the mass killing of indigenous Maya, these politically conservative groups argued that the dictator's Christian faith would compel him to improve the country's human rights situation. El Verbo's parent church in the United States, Gospel Outreach, called U.S. Christians to pray for Rios Montt. They argued that with Rios Montt in power, there was, quote, tremendous opportunity in Guatemala to show the life and power of Jesus Christ. Justice, prosperity, and blessings can come to a hurting people who are crying out for help. Jesus Christ himself is that help. This argument that the only salvation for the suffering of the Guatemalan people lay through salvation in Christ was very common among U.S. evangelicals. And the speeches that Rios Montt gave while in office seemed to indicate to U.S. evangelicals that he wanted to improve life in his country and spread the gospel. He said he wanted to turn Guatemala to God. And you can see him here at his first press conference, where he told reporters that God put him in power and that he had a mission to revitalize the nation's moral values, extend more human rights, and cut down on corruption. He reiterated these themes in weekly sermons and urged his countrymen to live according to Christian morals and to spread the gospel to all. He also appointed several members of his church to be advisors and received counsel from U.S. missionaries. Church members met with Reagan administration officials, U.S. embassy staff, and CIA officers in Guatemala and in the United States on all sorts of matters, from foreign aid to human rights to military funding. Even though there was evidence of human rights abuses, the Reagan administration embraced Rios Montt. They thought he could be an anti-communist ally in Central America, where the Reagan administration was engaged in covert wars. Now, despite Rios Montt's vows to end government corruption and human rights abuses, many thousands of left-leaning political activists, guerrillas, Mayan civilians, they perished under his counterinsurgency program. Some 3,000 per month, and thousands more were disappeared. Over 1 million people fled the country. And although later regimes were also abusive, Guatemalans have termed the period that he ruled as La Violencia, signifying it as a particularly brutal episode in a long and ruthless civil war that had plagued Guatemala for 30 years. Now, President Reagan wanted to send military aid to help Rios Montt fight his communist opponents. But the U.S. Congress was very concerned about reports of army massacres of civilians, as well as torture and kidnapping, and so they refused. They blocked funding. Evangelicals stepped in, though, to support Rios Montt and to help him secure military material from private sources in Canada and Israel. Televangelists like Pat Robertson called on viewers to raise money for Guatemala and to send letters to Congress and the White House calling for support for Rios Montt in his fight against what he termed the communist insurgency. Many U.S. evangelicals believe that by supporting Rios Montt, they'd be helping to defeat communism in Central America, and in so doing would make the region a safe haven for evangelism and the spread of their faith. And you can see this in the letters I have up here, both from Rios Montt and from one of his church members, Carlos Ramirez, who were calling on Christians in the United States to support him. And you can see in the piece from Carlos Ramirez that this is, Guatemala, the situation there is our opportunity to demonstrate God's alternative in the struggle for freedom, a sort of fight against communism. U.S. evangelicals also worked alongside the Guatemalan army to establish strategic hamlets in the countryside as part of Rios Montt's efforts to pacify rural areas and root out suspected communist insurgents. Evangelicals trusted Rios Montt when he argued that pacifying the countryside and removing the communist threat would bring justice, peace, and human dignity to poor villagers. These messages resonated with their evangelical beliefs about communism as an existential threat not only to a nation, but to global religious faith. When Guatemalan evangelicals claimed that under Rios Montt they could proselytize without fear of retaliation from guerrillas, it reinforced deeply held hopes that evangelicals might succeed in spreading the gospel to all people during their lifetimes. Now, had U.S. evangelicals consulted the Mayan or Catholic refugees who fled across the border into Mexico to escape violence, they might have heard a different, more realistic perspective on the situation. Instead, they and the Reagan administration backed Rios Montt, and they abetted genocide and state violence in the process. Their Christian nationalist beliefs that linked their faith with American values, coupled with their Christian internationalist goal to evangelize the world, they were key here. And they were also key in another Central American Cold War battleground, Nicaragua, which was one of the articles that we read for tonight. The Reagan administration, as you know, was deeply concerned about the Nicaraguan revolution that had ousted the right-wing dictator Anastasio Somoza, a development that it viewed as evidence of Soviet and Cuban efforts to seize control of Central America. The Reagan administration had a clear statement of its foreign policy aims at this point, that it set forth in a National Security Decision Directive, where it said the U.S. must have a policy where there's an ideological thrust which clearly affirms the superiority of U.S. and Western values of individual dignity and freedom. This perspective on what U.S. foreign policy should do shaped U.S. relations throughout the world. It was not the only national security directive that mattered, though. In 1981, the National Security Council met to decide on a policy response to the situation in Nicaragua. And they put out a different national security decision directive, this one NSDD 17. In that directive, they affirmed that the Reagan administration would support democratic forces in Nicaragua and lend assistance to anti-insurgency groups throughout Central America. In April 1981, Reagan authorized the CIA to train and arm the Contras, a group of counter-revolutionaries which included former members of Somoza's National Guard. As historian David Painter notes, although Reagan claimed that the goal of these policies was to halt Sandinista aid to growing leftist insurgents in El Salvador, quote, their main objective quickly became the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government. In addition to laying the groundwork for the covert counterinsurgent war against the Sandinistas, National Security Decision Directive 17 also set the stage for a pro-Contra public relations campaign in the United States, a campaign that drew very heavily on Christian nationalist themes and required the active involvement of evangelicals. The White House Office of Public Liaison framed the conflict as one in which Marxist guerrillas were attacking and persecuting Christians. As you know from the article I shared, the reality was that there were Christians on both sides of the conflict using Christian nationalist language. But for this White House campaign, the focus was on religious liberty in Nicaragua, a framing that appealed very much to U.S. evangelicals. In 1983, the Office of Public Liaison began holding weekly briefings on U.S. Central American relations for religious leaders that highlighted religious persecution by Sandinista forces in Nicaragua. For evangelical audience members, these briefings made manifest the peril that indigenous evangelists faced in their effort to share the good news with their compatriots, and thus the broader threat that the Sandinistas posed to the achievement of global evangelization. Evangelical organizations who were already publishing actively about religious persecution throughout the world amplified these messages from the Reagan White House. I have a couple examples here. Christian news services that focused on religious freedom shared regular updates with their readers about evangelicals who faced arrest and torture at the hands of the Sandinistas. These groups conveyed the impression that the Sandinistas engaged in widespread, yet selective religious persecution, targeting only those, quote, true Christians who rejected Marxism. In this way, they attacked the Sandinista nationalism of revolutionary Christians in Nicaragua while promoting their own version of Christian nationalism, a U.S. Christian nationalism rooted in democratic and liberal capitalist principles. Despite the allegations that the Reagan administration and its religious surrogates made about Sandinista religious persecution, U.S.-backed Contra forces committed extensive and appalling human rights abuses, which opponents of Reagan's policies publicized extensively. The extent and brutality of Contra human rights abuses intensified debates in Congress over Reagan administration requests for Contra funding in the mid-1980s. hence Reagan's desire to recruit conservative evangelicals to support his cause. Evangelical media personalities such as Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, whom the White House invited to receive special briefings from Oliver North, urged their followers to contact Congress in advance of pending votes on Contra funding. Their efforts bore fruit. Congress passed military aid to the Contras. U.S. efforts to bring about the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government through its support for the Contras was both destabilizing and deadly. Despite the rhetoric of democracy and freedom which evangelical activism helped propagate, the intervention revealed the imperial character of U.S. national security and power projection in the hemisphere. And the Contra War was, of course, not the only U.S. intervention into another state. It was certainly not the only one that involved this merger of evangelical aims, human rights language, and notions of democracy promotion. So to sum up here, the human rights vision that the U.S. evangelical foreign policy lobby promoted was one that rested on U.S. Christian nationalist assumptions and Christian internationalist desires. The notion that human rights came from God, that religious liberty was the primary right, and that religious liberty could only flourish in a democratic capitalist state has had a profound influence on U.S. foreign policy, really since the 1980s. The idea that you might uplift people out of communism through religious liberty and democracy promotion also has, I think, some pretty fascinating parallels with those 19th century ideas about Christianity bringing civilizational uplift that we discussed earlier. So by the end of the Reagan years, U.S. evangelicals had a very well-developed set of foreign policy objectives that blended their political and spiritual beliefs. They also had skillful lobbyists to promote their interests in Congress and a strong network that linked them with their co-religionists throughout the world. Evangelical foreign policy activism and political influence contributed to the passage of legislation such as the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998 and the Sudan Peace Act in 2002, legislation which, respectively, established the promotion of religious liberty worldwide as a priority in U.S. policymaking and which condemned human rights abuses in Sudan. Evangelicals marshaled their new foreign policy power to fight global human trafficking, especially during the administration of the evangelical George W. Bush. They also pushed his administration to impose a global gag rule on using U.S. aid money for providing abortion services or even accurate information about abortion services in other countries. Finally, a brief word on evangelicals in Israel. The power and influence that evangelicals gained through their foreign policy beginning in the 1970s gave them a platform that they could use to advocate for a range of international issues that they thought were important and that they viewed through the lens of their understanding of the Bible and God's commands. Christian Zionism and the protection of Israel were among those issues. Christian Zionists believe, based on their reading of the Bible, that God has a special covenant with Israel, that the modern state of Israel has special privileges and protections because of that covenant, and that, per the book of Revelation, the restoration of Jews to Israel is an essential step in an unfolding process that will culminate in the Battle of Armageddon, the return of Jesus Christ, and the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. Much as a strong belief in the biblical mandate to evangelize the world influenced the evolution of an evangelical human rights vision, eschatological beliefs, or beliefs about the end times, have informed evangelical activism on behalf of the modern state of Israel. The nature of these eschatological beliefs have gotten a lot of play in the media. They're pretty easy to sensationalize. Between that and the fact that the United States has, since 1948, had a special relationship with Israel, means that this aspect of Christian right policy activism has received extensive attention. Yet a hyper-focus on Christian Zionism has tended to both strip nuance out of how we understand that relationship and to downplay what I see as the main thrust of U.S. evangelical internationalism in the 20th century, which was creating a U.S. foreign policy that would create a world safe for evangelism. Christian nationalist beliefs were a key part of that larger goal, and they continue to shape U.S. foreign policy into the present day. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, but I'd love to talk more to answer additional questions or anything else you want to talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor. We do have quite a few questions queued up, but I'm going to start by going back just one slide. Sherilyn noted in the chat box that that's a pretty compelling image. Can you give us just a little bit more context of this picture?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely can. So this is an image. You'll see that that right there is that's Billy Graham. This image was taken in 1969, and it is from when he traveled to Jerusalem to visit the holy places in the city. And so you can see the backdrop of the city behind him, and he's sitting there with his guide. It's a really striking image.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you have a sense of the date of this image?
Yes, it's 1969.
69. Fantastic. Thank you. Next question comes from.
Oh, and I'll interject. I'll interject quickly. This is coming. Many sort of U.S. Evangelical interest in Israel really sort of took off after the 1967 war. So that's partly why he's there at that time, sort of a couple years later.
Got it. Next question comes from Monica. Monica's joining us from Five Oaks, North Carolina. And she's wondering, you hear a lot right now about Christian nationalism and modern Russia, Putin's Russia. Talk to us a little bit about the role of Christian nationalism from the other side.
Yes, this has been a sort of fascinating phenomenon to look at. So one of the things that I've observed is that there is now, and it's not just Putin's Russia, we're also seeing it in Hungary, a kind of embrace in some of these countries of what evangelicals in the United States would term sort of traditional values. And so Putin's embrace, for example, of anti-LGBTQ policies, those are pieces that really resonate with American, conservative evangelicals who see in people like Putin and in Viktor Orban defenders of Christianity, defenders of moral principles in a world that they see as becoming increasingly secular. This is very interesting in the case of Russia because, of course, during the Soviet period, there's not only a huge amount of religious persecution, there's an enormous amount of religious dissidence. And those religious dissidents, after the Soviet Union collapsed, they sort of explode. There's a huge interest in different churches, and the Russian Orthodox Church was very concerned about the U.S. Church folks coming over to plant new churches, or Russians not following the Christian Orthodox Church anymore. And even during the Soviet period, the Russian Orthodox Church had a close relationship with the state. They were a registered church. And so even within Russia, there's this conflict between kind of upstart religions and this classic sort of Orthodox Church. And we've seen a lot of statements from Russian Orthodox leaders lately about their support for the Russian aims to take over Ukraine. So I think U.S. Conservative Christians are looking to those leaders as being bastions of not just kind of power, although of course Russia right now is very weak, but also of these moral values.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that answer. This question comes from Sarah. Sarah's joining us from virtual Arkansas. She's got a comment, then a question. It goes like this. Over time, I've seen national religious affiliation survey results stating that more people are checking the boxes for none or unaffiliated when questioned about participating in Christian denominations or churches in general. This presentation has caused Sarah to think that people may be leaving the politics of the church rather than the idea of church itself. Do you think politics and foreign policy is a factor?
I absolutely do, and I have been saying this for a very long time, so I completely agree with this comment. And I say that in part because one of the things that's very interesting that we're seeing is that there are folks who are leaving, they do not want to be termed evangelicals, and this is especially true among traditional Black evangelical churches, so Black Protestant churches, which are, when we think of the definition of evangelical that I shared at the start, they absolutely fit in. But because of the politics of U.S. evangelicalism and the association between U.S. evangelicalism and conservatism or sometimes white supremacy, they are not calling themselves that, or they are kind of disassociating themselves from that. They still call themselves Christian on those Pew studies, but they're kind of massaging that a bit. I think we also are seeing, especially among young people, and I've certainly noticed this in my classes, and I think some folks even kind of mentioned this in their chat at the start, is that many young people are checking the none box because they associate all of U.S. Christianity with that conservative political thrust. So the engagement of evangelicals in politics may end up potentially, if we look, say, 50 years from now, cutting into their ability to kind of spread the gospel, at least in the United States. The other thing that I think is interesting about the rise of the nuns, the rise of sort of, it's not necessarily a rise of secularism. Some of those folks are still sort of have some kind of spirituality, and that's the other reason why we might see this as being a disdain for kind of the sort of conservatism of some aspects of the church. At the same time, there's also a kind of vibrant religious left that we should remember, even among evangelicals. So it's quite varied, but I do think that is a trend that I too have noticed.
Great, thank you so much for the question, Sarah. This question comes from Peter. Peter's in Curry Beach, North Carolina. He commented and noted that at the beginning of your talk tonight, the beginning of our webinar, you introduced yourself, you shared your background, and you clearly stated that you're not a Christian. His question is, do you recommend that? Or talk to us a little bit about the choice you made to say that up front when discussing tonight's topic. And do you recommend it when teachers approach the same things in their own classrooms?
So a couple semesters ago, I taught a class with a sociologist. And at the start of the class, she sort of explained to students the importance of talking about your positionality in your work and in your teaching. And historians don't usually do that. In many people in other disciplines, when they write their books or write their articles, they will explain their position on the topic, where they're coming from, because it so clearly affects the questions that they ask or the way they approach their research. I think historians should do this more because the questions we ask are also informed by present interests and sort of concerns. Not that makes us incapable of sort of being open-minded in our research, but it's important for people to know where we're coming from and why we're interested in certain topics. I think it's useful to state your positionality. And I think the fact that I'm writing as an outsider gives me not better, but different views on this topic than somebody within the faith might have. And again, it's not that it's a better view, it's just a different one. And so I feel like it's useful to say that. In my own classes, when I'm teaching, I don't typically talk about my own personal religious beliefs. I really just tend to stress that there's pluralism in this country and we need to be respectful of each other. So for me, this is more of a scholarly approach to saying, like, here's where I am.
Yeah, that seems so important, particularly as a historian. Thank you. Last question. This goes to Andy in Chapel Hill. That's me. And my question for you, Professor, is this. It's a complicated topic. You've walked us through several centuries and the narrative, but give us the one big takeaway. We've got educators from teaching kids, young people of all ages. They may not necessarily address this in their curriculum, or they might, but having this kind of perspective and view is only going to enhance how we discuss these kinds of topics more broadly. But give us a big takeaway. What should we make sure we emphasize when we think about the role of Christian nationalism in foreign policy?
I think the biggest takeaway that I can give is, in general, for anyone talking about U.S. politics or foreign policy, is that ideology and religion matter. Personal beliefs matter in shaping the policy of the United States. And given how powerful the United States is on the world stage, we have to take religion and religiously inflected ideology seriously if we're going to understand why the United States has done the things it's done and made the decisions it's made. It's not the only factor that drives foreign policy or politics. Of course it's not. All of these things are multi-causal. But you can't really understand U.S. politics or foreign policy if you don't grapple with America's pluralist religious background and the power of Christian groups in the United States.
Thank you so much for that answer. And it is a reminder that even though it's a difficult topic to approach, even though it may make us feel uncomfortable, that it is such an important one to address in our classroom and as we discuss these topics with our students. Professor Lauren Turek, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody who participated in the chat and attended. It was wonderful to get to engage with you all.
And I also want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us. We appreciate you spending the evening with us. Please do take a look at our social media feed and sign up for our email listserv for upcoming announcements and new activities. That does include the current open application process for More Than a Slogan, Understanding the Historical Perspective of Black Lives Matter. It also includes our next webinar, which will be October the 11th. I'll be joined by Michael Altman from the University of Alabama. And the topic and the title of that webinar will be Uncivil Religion, a resource for teaching about January 6, 2021. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day at school tomorrow. Continue for the rest of your week. We'll see you next time on the Humanities in Class webinar series.